The recording has now begun. Welcome to Design Systems Community Meetup number 6. That will be in the recording. You have all registered for accessibility and inclusivity in design systems. If you have not registered for this meetup, you're in the wrong building maybe. I'm sorry, but this is Wealthsimple, and if you can double confirm, then so can I. And now let's begin with a land acknowledgement. The land I am standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We have a land acknowledgement along with a set of values in order to uphold a certain set of standards and to reach out and acknowledge things that need change. We also have a code of conduct. The moment you walked in, this came into effect. Respect others, keep it legal, play nice, uphold the conduct and our values, and protect your privacy, please. Do you like restrooms? There are 4 of them. 2 at the back, plus 1, and 1 to the front in the hallway. There are food and refreshments. You may have heard about them. To your left, are there still more pizzas? Thank you, Jordan. Please be respectful of the place. This is a place where people work Monday to Friday, and sometimes the weekends. If you ever need to have any questions answered, look for one of us, the staff. We also wear yellow and black t-shirts. You have water. You also have Wi-Fi. Always offer your guests water and Wi-Fi. Finally, now you know so much about the space, let's talk about me and my friends. I'm Enrico Sacchetti.
My name is Varun.
I'm Lucy.
And we're excited to be here. All right, so usually design systems have principles, they have guidelines, and us as design system community have some values. We have 7 of them, but today we're going to focus on accessibility and diversity and inclusivity. These values, typically, when you're building a system, you would consider all these values, but when we're doing our meetups, we do take these very seriously too. So we're excited to have accessibility and diversity and inclusivity included as part of our meetup. Next, we have some DSC updates. We're looking for some speakers for June and July. I think we have 1 for June and 1 for July. So if you'd like to speak about design systems or something that your company is doing relevant to design systems, come and talk to me or Lucy or Enrico. And also, please do join the Accessibility Toronto meetup that happens, I think, monthly? Regularly in Toronto for more engagement with accessibility in all industries. That's A11YTO. And next, we're growing. We're a design systems community, but soon, starting today, we're Design Systems Community Chapter Toronto, and now we're starting a chapter in Berlin. And yeah, we're talking to more countries and more cities around the world to just sort of share the knowledge of design systems and sort of build this sort of global community so everyone can benefit. That's coming up.
So I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, James. So I know James from Shopify, but now he's at Wealthsimple. It's our loss. Yeah. So he's just going to talk a little bit about Wealthsimple today.
Hey everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Sweet. Hi, welcome. These guys did a great job of introducing you to the space. There's actually a few folks from Wealthsimple here, so maybe if you could all stand up at the back. They're hiding at the back. There you go. Those guys are on the design team here, and there's actually 2 people from our talent team over here as well, Mabel and Andrea. So I'm James, yep, like Lucy said, and we work together at Shopify, but now I'm at Wealthsimple and having a lot of fun. We're also working pretty hard on our design system right now. We have a lot of work to do, and so I'm very excited to host the meetup and enjoy the content with you guys. Does everyone put your hand up maybe if you've heard of Wealthsimple before coming here Awesome, that's good. Our brand team works. Maybe keep your hand up if you use Wealthsimple in any way. Awesome, awesome. So yeah, we build financial products that hopefully make financial services or tools easier and more accessible for people like yourselves. Hopefully it's not inhibitantly expensive for you to do so. It's not as complex as maybe traditionally it's been. And that's what we're working on. We're constantly working on different types of products. Everything from trying to replace and build for you a better checking and savings account to like your investments. Maybe you want to do some trading on some stocks that you really care about the company. Maybe you're filing your taxes right now through Simple Tax. We've been working on that as well. So yeah, if that is at all interesting and you want to talk to us about it, what it's like to work on a team, please feel free to reach out. You'll find me loitering around, I guess, later on. We are hiring right now for design. So if you want to come and talk to me, feel free.
Thank you, James. Also, I forgot to add, thank you for sponsoring this event today. And also thank you to the volunteers that helped us out as well at these events, because without you, we couldn't do what we do. So thank you.
I am what remains between you and the first talk of tonight. When you signed up for this event, we asked a question. In your opinion, what accessibility consideration is often overlooked? And with the power of technology, I have come up with the top 5 answers that you provided. Number 1, high contrast anything. Number 2, investing in accessibility experts. That's a good one. Number 3, color blindness. Number 4, focus management. I really like that one. And number 5, assistive technology user experience. Even though these aren't ordered by how easy they are to overcome, they are ordered by most overlooked as chosen by you. Fascinating. Let's get to that.
All right, we're going to kickstart with the agenda now. So the first talk is going to be the building blocks of an accessible design system starting in 2 minutes by George. The next one is International is Inclusive by Winter. The talks typically finish around 7:40. The venue closes around 8. I think we have a lot of beer and some pizza left. So once the talks finish, you can enjoy those.
All right, the moment you guys have all been waiting for. So our first speaker is George. I know George from TELUS, so I had the privilege of working with him at TELUS. He first introduced me to the topic of accessibility. And so that was the first time I've ever heard about it. And so both him and I kind of tackled accessibility issues for Kudo. So thank you for paving the way for me. So George has previously worked at Facebook, Scotiabank. He was the one of the original founders of A11YTO, and he does consulting on accessibility. So currently he's at accessibility manager at Slack. And today he's going to talk about the building blocks of an accessible design system. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Ooh, my voice usually doesn't carry, so this is a good change. All right, I wasn't planning about speaking about that, but accessibility, if you haven't noticed from my trajectory, working at different companies, has no industry. I went from banking to telecom to social media to whatever Slack is, and it's all the same in terms of the user problem. So. The building blocks of an accessible design system, I'm actually going to talk about some of the building blocks, the things that I found to be the most critical. I'm not going to cover anything and everything we did at Slack, for example, for building an accessible design system. I'm only going to talk about 3 things, and hopefully those stick with you and you find them valuable. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have built accessible products, however you want to define accessible? All right, how about accessible design systems? Shopify folks, hands on. That's really good. So I think there's something in there for everyone, whether you're just starting out or if you already have a pretty good idea of what you're doing. At worst case scenario, this is just how we've done it at Slack, and I hope you find it useful. I mentioned 3 things. The first one is that accessibility is an experience. Accessibility is not a QA checklist. And this may not be obvious or subtle, but when we started building, oh wait, I have this cool thing. Shout out to Salt Bay, the man who made salting steak an experience. What I mean by this is that accessibility is what people see or don't see. It's what they interact with, and it's what they hear if they're using a screen reader. If you are to go and build any other experience, whether it's a mobile app, a website, a feature, you wouldn't go about building that without actually speccing, designing, building, and then doing some testing, right? So accessibility is an experience. This is the main takeaway. Everything derives from here. So I'm giving you the takeaway at the very beginning. Ask yourself as how you're building the accessibility experience, ask yourself, how should my product work by keyboard? Because on the wide spectrum of disabilities, keyboard accessibility is probably the thing that is needed the most. If you have a mobility impairment, you cannot use the mouse, you use the keyboard. If you are blind and you're a screen reader user, you use the keyboard, you cannot use the mouse, obviously. So there's a wide variety of disabilities. Whatever you build on, most likely, whatever product you build, most likely you have to build keyboard. How should your product feature, whatever it is that you're building, work by keyboard? If this is the first time you're asking yourself the question, then hold on tight. And then same idea, how should my product work with a screen reader? What we've done at Slack was, when I joined Slack 3.5 years ago, Slack didn't work by keyboard at all, in the sense that we had a set of keyboard shortcuts, and anything that was not a keyboard shortcut was completely blocked. So basically, you couldn't do a tab to a link, you couldn't press enter to open a channel, or press a button, or anything like that. And instead of fixing all the random bugs, it's easy to go in and say, I have an accessibility ticket, I'm going to fix it, this button is going to work. We went on to spec the actual experience. How do I get from a workspace to a channel to a message to a reply, and then do something about it by keyboard? So we looked at the whole thing. Accessibility is an experience. We started with that. Once we've done that a few times, we codify the accessibility experience into what we call accessibility success criteria, and they are in plain language. Who knows what WCAG is? Perfect. For everyone else, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's the standard for how web products should work in terms of accessibility. The problem usually with WCAG is that people don't start to read WCAG to do accessibility, just like most engineers don't go to the W3C websites to read the HTML spec to build websites. So what we've done was we took WCAG, the parts that we're interested in to build first, abstracted, and we had 3 basic accessibility criteria that we were gonna spec as an experience and build it. So very simple, it's color considerations, it's keyboard navigation, and it's the screen reader experience. You might pick something else when you're doing accessibility, whether you're starting new or you're doing it already, based on your product type, based on your tech stack, based on basically all your environment. For example, at Scotiabank, the most important experience was keyboard, because if people wanted to go pay a bill, they have to go click a button, open, get the UI where you put in the amount, you put in the payee, you press next, you read a confirmation message, you approve, then you're done, right? If you're doing that with a screen reader, so you can't see anything, everything is through audio. You hear the UI, you really can't make mistakes on how that experience works, because people may not be able to pay their bills or pay $10,000 instead of $100. So you might pick, for example, if you work on a newspaper website, you might pick readability to be an important success criterion for you. This all depends on your environment. But to give you just some ideas, this was Slack's color palette 3 years ago. 136 colors, most of them not accessible. You can tell they're not accessible because they're crossed out. So this was, it was basically just a big mess. It was we decided that now that we've built a bunch of experiences and we've learned how we want to do accessibility, and now we have a criterion for design, one of the designers who later on joined the accessibility team basically took it upon himself to refactor this big mess that we had. And the first step that we took was not to remove all the inaccessible colors. And inaccessible, I mean, if you have a light blue link on a white background, might not have the sufficient color contrast ratio. So we didn't take the colors away. We wanted to educate people first. So you can use all these colors for your UI, your components, whatever. But just so you know, some of these things are not going to be accessible. And this happened about a year and a half after we started doing any accessibility. So we made sure that everything develops organically. We don't start with, here are the 15 accessibility requirements that you're going to meet. Good luck. That doesn't work. That was 2016. At the top, it's the message input who has super low contrast. And we updated our colors. And most of the design reaction within the company was, oh my God, this is grabbing so much attention and the other content and people's eyes are drawn and like all that stuff. All we asked was give it 2 days. In 2 days, if you still feel the same, then we'll take it out. And people just didn't feel the same, but we still switched to the old version and they're like, oh my God, I can't see that shit. Because of course, right? Now, I understand that whole idea of you want to use contrast properly because you want people to focus on certain content first and all that stuff, but it's not going to help anyone if people can see some of the content or the UI. It's just not going to help anyone. Here's a quick example from the engineering side and how I am the absolute worst. What's on the screen is a message from one of my colleagues they just shipped a feature on their launch day when everybody was celebrating and just throwing all those hundreds of emoji to the launch. I basically told them your stuff is not accessible. Sorry for rain on your parade. And that was a learning opportunity. What I'm trying to say is that we made mistakes. We didn't start with this grand idea that we're going to build experiences. We got to it in time. So what we did after every mistake or most mistakes is we went back to the drawing board, in this case, literally, and we spec'd the experience of this component. This probably was the first accessible component in our design system. We spec'd the exact experience, how it works by keyboard, what screen reader users hear, what the design considerations are, how do you focus a link or a text field. We used a blue ring, but you might use something else. All those things were written down. One of the benefits of speccing the experience is that you despecialize accessibility. When you're testing a product, QA might have a test plan, and then you have to do accessibility, and then we need another test plan for accessibility. If it's all in the spec, you don't need to do that. You just test against the spec. If it's not there, it's not built correctly against the spec. In summary, what I'm really talking about is that this is the fixing accessibility mindset. It's very, very reactionary. You go through product spec, you go through design, you go through engineering, and then let's test it for accessibility. Maybe it's okay. And that is my absolute biggest pet peeve, because that implies that you can do accessibility by accident. And no, you can't. You replace accessibility with anything else, like performance or like any other experience, and you'd never say, let's build this whole thing. Once we're done, let's test to see if it loads in under 2 seconds. Right? It doesn't make sense. But somehow people, at least in the past, have considered that to be okay. Let's test for accessibility, maybe it's fine. So anyways, fixing anything, not just accessibility, after the whole thing is done, after you made all the design decisions, tech decisions, product decisions, and then going back and fixing it, of course, is going to be expensive. So my next point, and the alternative to being reactionary, is to craft the experience. Then you craft the UI components or your design system components or elements. And what I mean by craft is I mean literally spec and design it. Here's what I mean. This is just an example of Slack's video product. We were designing, or maybe redesigning this a few years ago. I can't remember, sorry. But basically, we had this redesign opportunity, and it didn't. We had all these bugs. We had a backlog of accessibility issues. Buttons don't work, or they don't read well, or people can't see the colors. So instead of just going on and fixing stuff, being reactionary, we went on to spec the experience. So in this picture, all you're seeing is a bit of the UI when you're on a video call and the decisions designers made. So for example, when you tap through the UI, you get a blue ring so that you can see where you are if you have low vision. You can see the order. So I want, when you're tabbing, it shouldn't be random. You should have some sort of logical order. The tab flow, the focus indicator, and later on, even the screen reader UX. And this is kind of small, so let's make it bigger. So when we got to the screen reader experience, we realized that most of the UI in the feature was toggling, or had a binary state. Microphone, mute, unmute, video, on, off, that kind of stuff. And we realized that in this particular case, we can literally use the tooltips as the screen reader labels, and you would convey the same information. This is not the case for most other products or features, but the fact that we spec'd it meant that it was either going to be built like it, or we would just have a bunch of bugs, not against accessibility, but against the design spec. So again, despecializing accessibility. This is another example of a smaller feature. This was actually the first one that we said, maybe we should just spec the experience for how this feature works. This is just setting a status and how keyboard navigation works and the different buttons. It's literally the same thing. But the point is that we've done this a few times. We didn't focus on components. We focused on the experience, the accessibility experiences themselves. And then a bunch of stuff became really obvious in terms of how components should work. So once we started building our design system, for example, we had one of our components, like text inputs or text fields or anything like that. We didn't have to figure out how should this component take focus and how should the focus indicator look like. We already had the experience. We derived how components should work from the experience. But I keep pressing this point that you define the experience first and then the components. So, like, why? Does everybody agree with me that that's a confusing? Okay. Two main points. One is, at least from an accessibility perspective, UX dictates UI, not the other way around. The second point is that building UI components in isolation, so buttons, menus, basic individual components, could still result in inaccessible UX. You can build, you craft, you spec, design the accessibility experience, and then you can derive the accessibility of components. You do it the other way around, and it might not work. Here's an example. So channels in Slack, it's just basically, behind the scenes is a list of links. And we've defined a link as a component. It's not your basic anchor tag link. It's a bit more complex to do a bunch of stuff that we want. But at its core is a link. And if we were to, and we've actually done this in the beginning, we define how a basic link should work. Well, how do you get to a link? You tap to it. And what happens? You get a focus indicator. So like, perfect, job done. When we looked at the experience of how people were going through the channels list with the tab key, we realized that people had to tab through hundreds of channels in some cases. So the experience wasn't really that great. They would have, imagine this, you would have to tab 200 times every time you switch to a new channel. And, you would switch to a new channel, tab 200 times, and then you'll get to your messages. That's just to read messages, right? And people go pretty fast in Slack. So the experience of navigating a channel or any other feature dictated that, okay, maybe tab is not the best idea here, because like, yes, you can tab through everything, so it's technically accessible, but it's not really a great experience. So what we decided to do was to use up-down navigation, so really the up and down keys, to go through each channel, and tab instead would move focus in and out of the channels list. If you go to the WCAG spec, that's one way to do it. And in general, lists are supposed to be navigated this way. Imagine this, you have, I don't know, let's say search results, or you have a pop-up. The way you go through them is not tabbing, you use the up and down key. So we wanted to use the same idea, and this would free up tabbing to be a bit more, this would free up tabbing to allow us to go through the UI a little faster. If you needed to go through each channel, you can do that with the up and down key. That would be, we properly spec that so it would be announced as such to screen reader users. So like, hey, you're on a list, you can press up, down to go from one channel to another. Third thing, you should be very opinionated about your accessible design system or about accessibility, your accessibility solutions in general. The reason is that there are multiple ways to solve any accessibility or most accessibility problems. What I have on the screen is a screenshot of the W3C ARIA page, where it tells you there are 4 ways to label a control. A control is like a button, a checklist, a radio button, that kind of stuff. There are 4 ways to do that. Not all 4 ways are going to work for your design constraints, your tech stack, your design system. You have your own constraints within your own environment. Even if you can do 2 out of the 4, you should still standardize on 1 of them. Also, be very opinionated with your decisions. So back in 2016, when we didn't have a components library, we didn't have really accessibility criteria defined at all, one of the designers was told, just use this color because it's a best practice. And his response was, how is this a best practice if it's not accessible? And that triggered a whole lot of conversations between the design team to say, okay, have we really looked at all these decisions that we've made? Because we just assume that it's okay, but maybe it's not okay. Same idea with engineering. We had a bunch of tickets that I mentioned before, and we didn't really get to fix them until someone says, actual humans can't use the stuff that we built. How is this not a high priority? So be very opinionated, and if proven wrong, maybe you can back up, but best to go forth and apologize later than ask for permission. If there's any threads in general, beyond design systems, if there's any thread to how we did things, was because people took ownership of whatever accessibility area they had for their discipline. So there was the designer who said, this color palette is not great, I'm gonna go and propose a new solution. That sense of ownership is gonna take you a long way, as opposed to, I have a component, it's a bit more accessible, do you think this might work? Usually the answer is no, in my experience. As a final example, remember our infinite tab problem? Okay, it's not infinite, but if you're working at IBM and you have 100,000 people in a workspace, it's kind of infinite. Basically, nobody would tab through 300 channels to read a message, right? So we decided that up and down is going to be the pattern that we're going to use. And that was a very strong opinion based on the accessibility team's experience building all those or speccing all those other experiences in the past. So for example, what we decided to do was, we're going to use this up-down navigation model, not just in channels, but also in messages, and also in threads, and also in the search UI. Because in terms of cognitive load and muscle memory, you're getting used to navigating in a certain way, and you better not break my mental model, right? And people use Slack for a long time during the day, and any change is going to come with a cognitive cost, right? Does anybody have any questions before my wrap up? Oh, yeah.
Is this your Q&A period?
No. I'm just making sure that people are comfortable with content so far. And you interrupted someone. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead. How does this translate to the mobile experience? So what we built on the mobile side was all the design considerations that I mentioned earlier, color contrast, color blindness, indicating states with colors, so just like the basic stuff, and the screen reader experience. So on iOS, for example, we spec from the beginning the entire screen reader experience. On iOS, you turn on the screen reader, you swipe left or right, and your focus moves up or down. It's all very linear, obviously. And we decided that with one swipe, you should be able to read the entire message. And then, as we were looking at the experience, this is one of the important bits about speccing the experience, is it allows you to refine and really come up with really cool solutions. So the long story short is, on iOS, if we have a really long message, we actually curate it for users. Usually it reads something very robotic, like, Lucy said at 2:04 p.m., I don't know, something like, sorry, Lucy. So, something like that. The screen reader reads what's in the code, but you can curate it. So we're curating messages content so that it's easier to digest. So for example, if you're focusing the first message in a given day, it will tell you this is the first message on June 20. If it's a message that has an attachment or whatever else, is going to tell you that it has that. So it allows you to do some cool stuff. Our content or product writing team was very excited about that because they can, do maybe innovate or just come up with some new cool solutions that otherwise they wouldn't do. Yeah. So two things we did: design and screen reader. Okay, so to recap, what I mentioned are three things. We're good. Three things. One is, please start with the mindset that accessibility is an experience. Otherwise, you're always going to be fixing accessibility in QA. If nobody thinks about it in design or engineering, you're just going to be stuck in that loop. So treat it as such, and you'll be surprised about the consequences, the good consequences that come from it. Craft the experience first. If you don't have an opinion on how your product or feature works with accessibility, I don't see why you would be surprised that it doesn't work, or let's say keyboard users or screen reader users. And be very, very opinionated. I want my product or my feature to work like this. I'm not saying break accessibility rules. There are certain standards or patterns that are native, for example, to the browser. The way you select or between radio buttons, you do that with the up and down key. You don't have to reinvent that. But there's a lot of new UI and new UX and new stuff that people build. And if you don't decide what that experience is going to be like, somebody else is going to decide it for you. That's it. Thank you very much.
We just have, I think, 5 minutes for questions. We have.
Yes, question over here.
I work on a small team, and I do all the pushing towards accessibility. We have a product that we're trying to make accessible because it's public facing, and I wanted to see if you had any other tips and tricks for buy-in, because it feels like an uphill battle. I'm Sisyphus with a really huge accessibility rock.
What are the other functions or disciplines who are not convinced or they don't want to do accessibility?
Well, the design team's on board, and everybody outside of that is kind of humming and hawing about it. Dev teams, product owners, product managers, all the way up to the C-suite.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think that last part is the important part then.
Yeah.
So having the design team on board, but everyone else not, that's probably the best problem you can have. Usually, well, maybe I shouldn't do this, but it's a bigger challenge if the design team does not want to do it, and then maybe you have engineers kind of fixing some keyboard stuff and some alt text or whatever. Remember the point that I mentioned about despecializing accessibility? When we started speccing all that keyboard experience and the screen reader experience, we didn't tell teams that that's accessibility. We just told them this is how the feature should work. So it's despecialized in the sense that there isn't this special thing that is separate from my feature that I have to build. No, it's part of the feature. We didn't, try to hide it or anything like that, but for example, one challenge that we had, for some reason, this is a thing in the Bay Area, was to do as little manual QA as possible. So we were struggling to get even testing for something that we did right from the very beginning. So one way to do testing is to build the accessibility experience in the design spec, and then testers will test against that. Nobody has to go and write a separate test plan and learn about accessibility. They don't have to even know about WCAG. Does it do what the spec says or not? That's it.
Hi, George. I know as being one of your large customers, there's probably a lot of design problems that you've had because you support a lot of different platforms, from the native client, the web client, the apps that run on different mobile platforms. Can you maybe give us an example of how you had problems trying to design that to work on all these different platforms and how you overcome that design?
So we have fewer platforms or compatibility problems that you might think. The experience in a browser, regardless of the operating system, is the same as the experience in the desktop apps on all platforms, macOS, Linux, Windows, for a bunch of reasons. But basically, except for some native functionality like notifications, the experience is really the same. If you're asking about the design decisions that we have to make between desktop and mobile, one of them was what I mentioned earlier, this idea that you have one interaction and you can read a message for screen reader users, for example. So when we build that, for example, up-down navigation model to visit one message at a time, the screen reader will read that message for you. And we built that same sort of model on iOS as well. But it's not, even if we do the basic iOS accessibility stuff, you will not get that by default. You might get the equivalent of every swipe, that's the equivalent of tabbing on desktop. Every swipe will go through each and every link and each and every button and each and every reaction and each and every emoji and replies and all that stuff. So thank you for making my point, which is you really have to spec the experience, otherwise you'll get what you get.
Any more questions?
Hey, George. Thanks for the presentation. I really like your concepts about crafting the experience and having the experience have accessibility baked in. At the end of the chain somewhere, there's going to be an audit. So there are high-level tools out there, and then there are low-level, some built around X. So can you talk a little bit about mobile-specific tools that are maybe helping your mobile auditing process, both for iOS and Android? Or I don't know if you guys are using libraries like React, but what that looks like when using those auditing tools for mobile.
Yeah, you might know more about this than me. We're not very sophisticated in terms of accessibility tools on mobile. The engineers use the standard stuff that you get from both iOS and Android, the accessibility inspector on iOS, the equivalent of on Android for basic things like buttons are labeled, like, I don't know, stuff takes focus, you can swipe to buttons, for example. But at Facebook, for example, we're much more sophisticated in terms of tooling, and automated testing was a big deal. We don't have that at Slack. What we have is we have the process that I mentioned where you spec the experience through and through. By the time it gets to QA, the worst that we get are a bunch of bugs because something was not implemented correctly against the spec. But yeah, we don't have any other tooling. Sorry.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. I work as a UX designer and our project now is we're developing project management simulation web application, and we are at MVP phase. The requirement is compliance with AAA accessibility level. Yes, and the question is, do we need an expert or somebody? Because stakeholders, they insist we do not need that, and like we are using just online check-in test or something. The question is, when do we need that?
So first of all, so I mentioned WCAG earlier. WCAG is the standard for accessibility, and there are 3 levels to WCAG. Single A compliance, double A compliance, triple A compliance. And basically, the higher you go, so on triple A, you have to meet all the accessibility guidelines. The level triple A is mostly academic. Probably the W3C website does not meet the AAA compliance level. I'm making that up. I don't know if that's true. But basically, there's no, I've been working with jurisdictions across the world, Europe, Asia, North America, you name it. And no, there's no legislation in this world that is requiring that. The standard is WCAG 2 AA, or the ones who are more modern is WCAG 2.1, which is just an addition, an update to the previous standard. In my opinion, you shouldn't aim for AAA. Again, I don't know what the reason is for doing that. If the stakeholders of that decision are so confident, then ask them to go and spec the experience to meet AAA. Because even the best accessibility experts out there, they have, most people have an opinion on why your stuff is not accessible. Most people won't be able to tell you how to make it accessible based on the standards, your environment, your design system, your tech stack, your, all those constraints. So this is not easy. My beef with the accessibility consulting world is that it's mostly, let's do a big audit, which the best audits out there is going to tell you how your product is at a point in time. It gives you no direction how to improve it over time. I'm very opinionated, sorry. So my recommendation is, I think this needs to be a serious discussion, because I wouldn't do that at all. Yeah.
The good thing is the session is recorded, so you can always use that. Thank you,
All right.
George.
Let's give a round of applause for George. Thank you so much. How are we feeling? Good? Okay, so our next speaker is Winter. Hi. So she's been compared to the likes of Yo-Yo Ma. She's a skilled cellist. She previously worked for Kira Systems, designing for AI, human interaction, and information retrieval. She currently works at Shopify as a UX manager for internationalization and globalization. Yeah, welcome Winter. She's here to talk about designing for people everywhere.
Thank you. My name's Winter. Let's get started to talk about designing for people everywhere. So I have a fair bit of content to cover, so I'll kind of give you a run through of what we'll be covering today. So first, we'll talk about why internationalization is part of inclusive design. We'll talk about some definition and processes in terms of internationalization and localization. And then we'll dive into the work that we're doing at Shopify in terms of internationalizing our design systems, and also looking into the future of what we will be doing. And then in the end, we'll do a recap. Okay, so this is hello in all the languages that I can't pronounce. Probably a couple. So again, I'm Winter. I'm the UX manager of product internationalization at Shopify. These are the Twitter handles. Feel free to ask me questions and tweet to these awesome people. All right, so let's talk about internationalization and inclusive design. But rather, I'd really wanted to talk about what does it mean to design for people everywhere. Give me a show of hands if you're not from Canada. And you speak a different language, you're from a different culture, great. So you will resonate with the next 5 minutes, I hope. So yeah, what makes international audience different? Let's start with something as common as address forms. In North America, we start with your name, like street number, street name, postal code, city. Whereas in Japan, you put your last name in front of your first name, and sometimes you also have to spell out how the name is actually pronounced, because just by looking at the kanji, you can't really tell how it's pronounced. Usually people put the postal code in front of their street name. So yeah, just like something as common as address forms, they might look very different from all over the place. Next up, as common as address formatting, currency formatting also look very, very different. Even within the same country, Canada, if you're in Ontario, that's what you see in the first line. If you're in Quebec, the second line is what you usually see. So just in terms of where you place the currency symbol, the currency code, whether you use a period or a comma for decimal places or thousand separators, they're all very different in different places. Next thing, color usage. So one of our UX managers spent a few months in China, and she did a complete audit of all the apps in China and found, wow, a lot of them are in red. Why is that? Because even though red is commonly used for danger and air states in North America, is actually considered a very lucky color in China. Therefore, everything is in red. UX patterns. So a very common UX pattern in Japan is to spell out the steps that you have to take to complete a task up front. So here you are looking at a website. I have no idea what this is, but it has 7 steps. Similarly, so this is actually the sign-up form for Rakuten, which is a pretty large e-commerce site. This is literally their sign-up form translated into English. So again, you see at the top the step 1, 2, 3. That's a very common form, but also they really spell out the warnings up front instead of in North America, you usually see that hidden in tooltips. So here it says, you cannot register your user ID as a password to avoid cybercrime. Please choose a complex password. Something that's more close to the world of Shopify is payment methods. So in the US, I think this number was from 2018, so fairly recent. Most people pay by credit card or cash, and mobile is not commonly used for payment. Whereas in China, most people pay by WeChat or Alipay, and they're all mobile apps. So just that major commerce behavior there. Something that my team and I are kind of working on right now is in Brazil, the perceived privacy. Right? So this is actually a screenshot of a major Brazil e-commerce like marketplace. So basically, as you were signing up, they asked for your tax ID, which is the CPF thing up there. So tax ID is the equivalence of our social security number, and that is being asked for basically at the moment you sign up within your personal information. So just how people from different places think about security and privacy is also very different. What happens when internationalization goes wrong? So we all use these emojis a lot of the times on Slack. They all convey some sort of positive emotions for us. Not in these places. So in each of these places that I noted, these hand gestures means something that's very insulting. So be careful. This is yet another example that I think is a lot closer to our world for people who think about digital products and websites. So this is a major Chinese news portal. Out of curiosity, I toggled English on, and this is what I see. You may have already noticed what happened to the spacing when the word is very long. What happens to standard addition that goes out of the bound of the toggle? What happened when the word is being broken up, or capitalization is all over the place, or it's being blocked. But at the bottom here is just straight up not translated. So I want you to kind of take a moment to think about your user who is not speaking your language, who is stumbling upon a translated site or product of your build, and this is the experience that they get, right? So imagine what that would feel like. Therefore, we argue that designing with an international audience in mind is really part of inclusive design, and that should be really considered seriously, especially at the age of globalization. So we've covered a lot of differences, but are there more? You bet. So think about things that are translation related. Text direction. We know that in certain languages, they go from right to left. Grammatical gender is expressed differently in different languages. Pluralization rules are different. Therefore, you should think about your search keywords and SEO. Idioms are different in different cultures. What about voice and tone? And then formatting. We sort of talked about currency formatting and address formats, but what about date and time? What about name? What about measurement units? Phone numbers, paper size? Technical. So we know that in certain countries, people prefer the use of mobile. The keyboard layout is different in different countries. Therefore, keyboard shortcuts are different. Internet speed is vastly different in different countries. Legal things, tax names, tax charges, privacy requirements, geopolitics. And then commerce, payment methods, shipping methods, banking is different, insurance is different. So yeah, the list goes on and on, guys. So how can we possibly remember all of this, let alone adjusting our designs to adjust to all of these things? The answer, as you might have guessed, is the design system. So Jinsania, who is a senior UX manager of our Polaris team, says that the goal of the design system really is to operationalize the overall design approach of a company. Therefore, along the same line, we can say, maybe we wanted to just operationalize UX internationalization as much as possible by incorporating it into our design system. Now, it's a good place for us to kind of take a step back and think about some definitions and processes. So first, some terminologies you will run into from time to time. For example, the word that we've just said a million times, internationalization. It's such a long word, but because in tech industry, I guess people are lazy, so why do you have to spell out the whole word instead of just put a number in front of 2 letters? The same thing that we do with accessibility, right? There's 18 letters in this word, so I18N is what we used to say about internationalization. So internationalization is really the process of generalizing a product so that it could handle multiple languages, cultural conventions without the need for redesign. So think about internationalization as like building the foundation, and then you can tailor on top of it. So it'll like make sure that your design work out of the box for different markets. So naturally, the next thing that we're going to talk about is localization. Same train of thought. L10N is how we write localization. So that is taking a product and making it linguistically and culturally appropriate to the target locale where it is used and sold. So localization really allows new things to be tailored to work properly to a market. So instead of just having something that's very generic to be tailored to be presented to all the different markets, localization really allows you to make that tailor. Also, I don't know if I should mention this, but this is not to be confused with building some really highly local feature for a country. So if we're to think about, I don't know, how many of you have had McDonald's in a different country? Good, so you know what I'm talking about. You can get things you would never get here. That's kind of building a really highly local feature, whereas if you think about McDonald's menu, then localization will be translating the menu into different languages, setting the price according to what their standard is, that kind of thing. So Shopify actually went international not very long ago. So this whole thing is still pretty new to us. We do have sort of country teams that are in country, like on the ground, looking at the different needs, and they're like building kind of highly local features. But we figured that there is actually a need for a team to build out that foundation of internationalization, which is kind of where my team comes in. And this year we set out to enable all the product teams to achieve international experience parity through scalable tools and services. So international experience parity really is what I meant by regardless of where you come from, regardless of your culture and your language, once you start using Shopify, you get the same good experience. So how do we do that? This is where we talk about internationalization and our design system. So first, start with some basic guidelines for international friendly designs. So for us, we sort of came up with 3 very basic guides. Whenever you design, always plan for text expansion, always plan for changes in the word order of a sentence, also plan for cultural differences. We didn't invent these guides ourselves. They have been very well documented and discussed by a lot of global companies. So we simply just took them. So I think one of the things is really try not to reinvent the wheel. If something is already out there, just start with them. And I'll briefly explain what each of these things mean. So text expansion. You look at the word views in English. This is what it looks like in all the different languages. Pay special attention to Italian. It's 3 times long as English. So lessons to be learned here is that when texts are translated, they can get very long, sometimes as much as 3 times. And so this is what happened when we first translating our admin into different languages in French. I guess this is in French. And the buttons break, surprise, because the texts are not wrapping. So always plan for text expansion. Next up, changes in word order. What do I mean by that? So this is yet another UI components within the Polaris system a while ago. It looks so nice, right? Like it has a very natural way of like spelling out the drop downs, and it just reads very naturally until it's translated into a different language, and the structure of the sentence completely breaks down. And the third thing is cultural differences. This is the most vague one because how are you going to capture cultural differences? But let's start with something that's fairly easy, things like icon or images. On the left, we see this is what mailboxes look like in North America. On the right is what mailboxes look like in Japan. So when you think about using icons to convey some messages, always keep these things in mind. So once we have some really basic tips or guides, we get to work. One thing I really do want to mention here is that there are probably other guidelines that we should come up before we do anything, but I think it's always better to start somewhere than not doing anything, and just wanted to wait for that perfect moment to take action. So with these 3 basic guides in mind, what we did next is that we did a complete audit of all the components, the thing that George said not to do first. So basically what we did is, this is basically a complete list of all of our Polaris components. And we used the 3 guidelines. And the thing here, you see all the red thing, that's right to left. We're not gonna worry about that for now. So we take basically a complete audit of all of our components against these 3 basic guidelines, and we drafted recommendations and cautions for each component as like our basically the first pass. So as of today, all the Polaris components now support text expansion, so the buttons that you saw earlier no longer exist. There are also no components that have inherent word order. One thing I do have to note is that if the word itself is very long, then that still breaks. We're working on that. And the next thing that we did is really trying to extrapolate patterns by solving real life problems. So what do I mean by that? If teams, as we all know, design system always evolves. When teams find the need to build new components or new patterns, we wanted to really put in preventative measures for them to think about how these new components will work for international. So one of the example is, I think this is our channels team came to us and asked, we want to use this pattern. It like looks really nice in English, but once we're translating that into Finnish, again, breaks. Eventually, where we landed is a simple drop down without the fancy stuff, but it takes care of the text expansion problem. So here is really kind of like, think about what we used to talk about, like mobile first, right? Because I think the idea behind it is really thinking about what the constraints are and just work with that constraints. The other thing that we did is create design guidelines and dev implementations. What do I mean by that? We just saw this a while ago. So we know that currencies are formatted differently across the world. So how do we make sure that all of our merchants will have a consistent yet localized currency experience, regardless of where they're from? So what we did is that we drafted a currency formatting guideline, and this is where I'm going to echo what George was just saying, starting with, I'm quoting you a lot. So always start with experience. With this work, our starting place is really, what are the currencies that the merchants are looking at? Are there their store currencies? Are there buyer currencies? What are the tasks that they need to complete by looking at the currency? Do they just need to check their sales number, or do they actually need to refund, right? Because you can imagine the seriousness of understanding exactly what kind of currency they're looking at is very different when you have to just look at a number of your sales or just like refund a big order. So we drafted these design guidelines to make sure that every design team who uses this will design a consistent and localized currency experience. And the other thing we did is that we create APIs so that the developers can actually call the correct format based on the guidelines very easily. So another thing that I will mention it later, but one of the things is if you can make a tool for people to easily incorporate these design guidelines in their work, I think that's always a better thing to do. So what I just covered is really a start of our work, and we still have so much to look forward to, and I'll just briefly talk about what are some of the things we might tackle together with the Polaris team. So think about the fundamentals of our design system: colors, typography, illustrations, iconography, spacing, and grid. And like earlier, we looked at how colors are perceived very differently in different cultures. So how can we make sure that our design system is expressive enough to capture these differences? Similarly, typography, iconography, how can we make sure that the icons are appropriate for different cultures and locale? And next up, design principles. So at Shopify, we have 6 experience values. So a Shopify experience should always feel considerate, empowering, crafted, efficient, trustworthy, and familiar. And that's pretty straightforward. But through our research from merchants from different countries, we actually realized, for example, the bar for trustworthy is much, much, much higher in Germany because people in Germany just care about security and privacy so much, which is, again, if you think about earlier, I was talking about the example from Brazil where people are like, yeah, I'll give you my social security number, no big deal. So how can we make sure that these experiences can be manifested based on the culture where the people are experiencing them from? You know, what does trustworthy mean here in North America may not be what trustworthy means in Germany, for example. And this is kind of what I was just talking before, just building all the tools for designers and developers so that instead of for them to always think about, you know, oh, maybe I should think about text expansion, but like build it into their design tools and design processes so that it becomes just an automatic thing. And again, design system in a way is a tool, right? So we're building these things into the design system, which is a tool so that people can just take the tool and magic happens. So one of the tools that we developed is called a pseudo localization. It's a Figma plugin. Previously, there's a Sketch plugin, but we don't use Sketch anymore. So what it does is that it kind of converts your text into a pseudo language, but basically expands your text size. So then if you're a designer, you're working on a UI and you want to see if your UI will break or not, or whether you should think about a different UI pattern altogether, you just translate them into this pseudo language. This is kind of in really early alpha version, and we're starting to circulate it within our internal teams to collect feedback. All right, we covered a lot. I don't know how much time I have, but anyway. Thank you for sitting through all of this. So let's recap on our main point. First of all, we've already established that designing with an international audience in mind is part of inclusive design. And because as we're in this age of globalization, right? I think it's really important that we start considering users that are from a different culture than us. And if you and your team are considering internationalization or international users, these are some of really simple steps you can take if you haven't done so. So establish some internationalization guides. Again, don't reinvent the wheel. If it's already out there, just use them. Audit your components if you haven't audited them. Think about UI patterns, what could work better for different audiences, create guidelines, build tools. And, but I think there's a lot more that we can do as a community. I think internationalization and localization, especially in the realm of design, it's still very, very new. Obviously, there's a lot we can learn from our fellow accessibility advocates, how they continue to improve their expertise and advocate for inclusive design, and how do they work with the design system, as we just heard. And then I think this is the fun part. And I think that's definitely what draws me to it, is you get to actually learn about all the different cultures and turn this knowledge into the design implications, right? And then also just advocate for international users within your organization. And lastly, as I said, because we're such a new field, let's build a community to kind of improve our crafts together and to make the world a better place. It takes a village. Thank you. And all the thank yous I can't pronounce in different languages.
All right, it's time for questions. We got 3 questions.
You mentioned a lot about the cultural differences in different countries, and you have showcased the UI component in the design system, but where or how do you guys document the cultural differences so the designer in different locations can have those information?
Yeah, that's something that we're working, kind of a work in progress. The goal really is to think about whether maybe we'll have like a one-pager for each main country that we're targeting, right? What are the things, if you're designing a feature, right? Like, what do you need to know about Germany, for example? What do you need to know about Japan? What do you need to know about China and that kind of thing? So also I wanted to caution that for a lot of products, especially if you're as big as Shopify, having a different UI for a different country is just simply not possible. So how can you actually incorporate these differences as much as you can, which is why internationalization is actually quite important in the early stage. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Do you guys also test with the local users?
For local features, we do.
Okay.
For international, like for just generic features, what we're trying to do right now is basically to try to urge all the designers within Shopify to think about these internationalization guides, like text expansion, that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah.
All right, 2 more questions left.
You were talking a lot about localization, and I'm wondering, how do you localize in a globalized world? What I mean is, like, for example, I live here, but my culture is not this one, or I'm buying in a store from another country. So how do you take all of these things into consideration?
You mean like when the designer is not from the culture that they design for?
When the user is. Like, if you have a user, so if you're localizing for a country, if the store is from that country, that kind of makes sense. But if I'm visiting that country, do I get to see the store there or the store, like, I'm not explaining myself, but so for example, let's imagine that I'm traveling to Japan. I'm seeing a different store than when I'm here. Or if I have a store, but someone is buying in my store from another country, what do they see? Do they see my local store from my country, or do they see their part? Like, are you taking into consideration that part where people is not totally local from a place, but is more global?
Right. So you mean, so for example, with Shopify, our merchants, if a Canadian merchant is selling to Japan, what would they do? Or what would the Japanese buyer see from? Yeah. So, yes. Thank you. So yeah, so that's something also we're working on, is how do we enable basically merchants to sell cross-border by giving them the option to turn their stores into different languages, give their ability to turn on different currencies. So yes, they will. So basically, we understand that our merchant experience is their success is our success. So we definitely want the local buyers to experience to have a local experience when they visit a merchant, even though the merchant might not be from that country. Yeah.
All right, 1 final question.
Okay, so just in continuation of that, so what happens if you said that the users in the local area, you want it to be accustomed to them, right? What happens if someone's traveling and they're in that local area, but they don't want necessarily the local experience? They want something like what they had when they were at home, because they wouldn't necessarily always understand the local experience. Is there customization like per user in that way?
Well, no, it's by locale, right? So there's always the option that's like, okay, you know how like when you go onto a website, you can choose the location. And even though it depends on the setting, and this is, I guess, is still a work in progress. And if say I'm a Canadian buyer and I'm in Japan, and I like maybe the first thing I see is the Japanese storefront, but I can always turn it back to the Canadian domain, or just a different site or a different experience for sure.
And then you consider that even though you're in Japan, you need like the certain things like the addresses, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever that's showing on your storefront should be based on whatever that person looking at that locale.
But if I'm in Japan, I don't want the Canadian addresses.
Well, oh, I see what you mean. That's a good point. That is worth considering. Yeah. So there is also, there is a difference between country, so which is why we always say locale. So that's a combination of country and language, right? So for example, if you're Canadian living in Japan, you might want to see the Japanese address because you live there, but then you also want to see the website or the storefront in English because that's the language that you're familiar with. Yeah. So there's 2 layers there. Yeah.
Okay, that's the end for questions. Winter's going to be around, so if anyone else has more questions, you can ask her directly. Thank you so much, Winter. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Locales. Reminds me of my experience with Netflix. Come talk to me after. All right, let us progress. Our next meetup might not happen on April 1st, so please stay tuned for announcements. Due to the global issue arising around coronavirus, also known as COVID-19, we noticed that a lot of conferences or meetups are canceling. So we want to protect your health and safety above the content and the fun stuff we do here. So please stay tuned. We'll watch the news carefully and make a decision that is optimal. TBD is the name of the game. And thank you for attending. If you have a cellular device, please scan the QR code on the screen here. We love your feedback, please. You can tell us how things are done well or not well, or head over to this website, bit.ly/DSC-MAR, as in March, 4. Please fill in the survey. Let us know how we did and contact us later. And that's all.
That's all. Thank you.
Wait, what's this? This session is recorded. We'll do our best to provide you resources. We're sort of holding the recordings, not intentionally. We just don't have the capacity to crunch them and transcribe them and give them to you, but we will. We want to. We'll give you slides. We'll give you recordings. Please hang tight. Thanks again.
We got some more beer and pizzas, so please help yourself. Thank you.